And there we were. And I'm convinced that is what drove whoever interrupted us on the loudspeaker mad. The loudspeaker started crackling, you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what's happening. Above your head, something's gone wrong with the mic, or the acoustics, or whatever.
You were speaking?
I was speaking. I was on stage at that moment. It was an interruption. I don't quite know what that interference is, and I suppose the best thing to do is to ignore. And the voice said, "Mr. Baldwin, we can't have no talk like that." And everyone was stunned. And I just repeated what I'd said, Mr. Baldwin is nevertheless going to finish his opening statement. And I will tell you now, whoever you are, and if you assassinate me in the next 2 minutes, I am telling you this. It no longer matters what you think. The doctrine of white supremacy on which the Western world is based has had its hour, has had its day, is over.
Let me tell you a story. The New York Times Magazine, Sunday, April 9th, 1967, page 26. Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, by James Baldwin. When we were growing up in Harlem, our demoralizing series of landlords were Jewish, and we hated them. We hated them because they were terrible landlords and did not take care of the building. A coat of paint, a broken window, a stopped sink, a stopped toilet, a sagging floor, a broken ceiling, a dangerous stairwell, the question of garbage disposal, the question of heat and cold, of roaches and rats, all questions of life and death for the poor, and especially for those with children. We had to cope with all of these as best we could. Our parents were lashed down to futureless jobs in order to pay the outrageous rent. We knew that the landlord treated us this way only because we were colored, and he knew that we could not move out. The grocer was a Jew, and being in debt to him was very much like being in debt to the company store. The butcher was a Jew, and yes, we certainly paid more for bad cuts of meat than other New York citizens, and we very often carried insults home along with the meat. We bought our clothes from a Jew and sometimes our second-hand shoes, and the pawnbroker was a Jew. Perhaps we hated him most of all. The merchants along 125th Street were Jewish, at least many of them were. I don't know if Grant's or Woolworth's are Jewish names, and I well remember that it was only after the Harlem riot of 1935 that Negroes were allowed to earn a little money in some of the stores where they spent so much. Not all of these white people were cruel. On the contrary, I remember some who were certainly as thoughtful as the bleak circumstances allowed. But all of them were exploiting us, and that was why we hated them. But we also hated the welfare workers, of whom some were white, some colored, some Jewish, and some not. We hated the policemen, not all of whom were Jewish, and some of whom were black. The poor, of whatever color, do not trust the law, and certainly have no reason to. And God knows we didn't. If you must call a cop, we said in those days, for God's sake, make sure it's a white one. We did not feel that the cops were protecting us, for we knew too much about the reasons for the kinds of crimes committed in the ghetto. But we feared black cops even more than white cops, because the black cop had to work so much harder on your head to prove to himself and his colleagues that he was not like all the other niggers. We hated many of our teachers at school because they so clearly despised us and treated us like dirty, ignorant savages. Not all of these teachers were Jewish. Some of them, alas, were black. I used to carry my father's union dues downtown for him sometimes. I hated everybody in that den of thieves, especially the man who took the envelope from me, the envelope which contained my father's hard-earned money, that envelope which contained bread for his children. Thieves, I thought, every one of you, and I know I was right about that, and I have not changed my mind. But whether or not all these people were Jewish, I really do not know. The army may or may not be controlled by Jews. I don't know, and I don't care. I know that when I worked for the army, I hated all my bosses because of the way they treated me. I don't know if the post office is Jewish, but I would certainly dread working for it again. I don't know if Wanamaker's was Jewish, but I didn't like running their elevator, and I didn't like any of their customers. I don't know if Nabisco is Jewish, but I didn't like cleaning their basement. I don't know if Rikers is Jewish, but I didn't like scrubbing their floors. I don't know if the big white bruiser who thought it was fun to call me Shine was Jewish, but I know I tried to kill him and he stopped calling me Shine. I don't know if the last taxi driver who refused to stop for me was Jewish, but I know I hoped he'd break his neck before he got home. And I don't think that General Electric or General Motors or RCA or Con Edison or Mobil Oil or Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola or Firestone or the Board of Education or the textbook industry or Hollywood or Broadway or television or Wall Street, Sacramento, Dallas, Atlanta, Albany, or Washington are controlled by Jews. I think they are controlled by Americans. And the American Negro situation is a direct result of this control. And anti-Semitism among Negroes, inevitable as it may be, and understandable, alas, as it is, does not operate to menace this control, but only to confirm it. It is not the Jew who controls the American drama. It is the Christian. The root of anti-Semitism among Negroes is, ironically, the relationship of colored peoples all over the globe to the Christian world. This is a fact which may be difficult to grasp, not only for the ghetto's most blasted and embittered inhabitants, but also for many Jews, to say nothing of many Christians. But it is a fact, and it will not be ameliorated. In fact, it can only be aggravated by the adoption on the part of colored people now of the most devastating of the Christian vices. Of course, it is true, and I am not so naive as not to know it, that many Jews despise Negroes, even as their Aryan brothers do. There are also Jews who despise Jews, even as their Aryan brothers do. It is true that many Jews use, shamelessly, the slaughter of the 6 million by the Third Reich as proof that they cannot be bigots, or in the hope of not being held responsible for their bigotry. It is galling to be told by a Jew whom you know to be exploiting you that he cannot possibly be doing what you know he is doing because he is a Jew. It is bitter to watch the Jewish storekeeper locking up his store for the night and going home, going with your money in his pocket to a clean neighborhood miles from you, which you will not be allowed to enter. Nor can it help the relationship between most Negroes and most Jews when part of this money is donated to civil rights. In the light of what is now known as the white backlash, this money can be looked on as conscience money merely, as money given merely to keep the Negro happy in his place and out of white neighborhoods. One does not wish, in short, to be told by an American Jew that his suffering is as great as the American Negro's suffering. It isn't, and one knows that it isn't from the very tone in which he assures you that it is. For one thing, The American Jew's endeavor, whatever it is, has managed to purchase a relative safety for his children and a relative future for them. This is more than your father's endeavor was able to do for you, and more than your endeavor has been able to do for your children. There are days when it can be exceedingly trying to deal with certain white musical or theatrical celebrities who may or may not be Jewish. What in show business is a name, but whose preposterous incomes cause one to think bitterly of the fates of such people as Bessie Smith or King Oliver or Ethel Waters. Furthermore, the Jew can be proud of his suffering, or at least not ashamed of it. His history and his suffering do not begin in America, where black men have been taught to be ashamed of everything, especially their suffering. The Jew's suffering is recognized as part of the moral history of the world, and the Jew is recognized as a contributor to the world's history. This is not true for the blacks. Jewish history, whether or not one can say it is honored, is certainly known. The black history has been blasted, maligned, and despised. The Jew is a white man, and when white men rise up against oppression, they are heroes. When black men rise, they have reverted to their native savagery. The uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto was not described as a riot, nor were the participants maligned as hoodlums. The boys and girls in Watts and Harlem are thoroughly aware of this, and it certainly contributes to their attitude toward the Jews. But of course, my comparison of Watts and Harlem with the Warsaw Ghetto will be immediately dismissed as outrageous. There are many reasons for this, and one of them is that while America loves white heroes armed to the teeth, it cannot abide bad niggers. But the bottom reason is that it contradicts the American dream to suggest that any gratuitous, unregenerate horror can happen here. We make our mistakes, we like to think, but we are getting better all the time. Well, to state it mildly, this is a point of view which any sane or honest Negro will have some difficulty holding. Very few Americans, and this includes very few Jews, wish to believe that the American Negro situation is as desperate and dangerous as it is. Very few Americans and very few Jews have the courage to recognize that the America of which they dream and boast is not the America in which the Negro lives. It is a country which the Negro has never seen, and this is not merely a matter of bad faith on the part of Americans. Bad faith, God knows, abounds, but there is something in the American dream sadder and more wistful than that. No one, I suppose, would dream of accusing the late Moss Hart of bad faith. Near the end of his autobiography, Act 1, just after he has become a successful playwright and is riding home to Brooklyn for the first time in a cab, he reflects, quote, "I stared through the taxi window at a pinch-faced 10-year-old hurrying down the steps on some morning errand before school, and I thought of myself hurrying down the streets on so many gray mornings out of a doorway and a house much the same as this one. My mind jumped backward in time and then whirled forward like a many-faceted prism, flashing our old neighborhood in front of me, the house, the steps, the candy store, and then shifted to the skyline I had just passed by, the opening last night, and the notices I still hugged tightly under my arm. It was possible in this wonderful city for that nameless little boy, for any of its millions, to have a decent chance to scale the walls and achieve what they wished. Wealth, rank, or an imposing name counted for nothing. The only credential the city asked was the boldness to dream," end quote. But this is not true for the Negro, and not even the most successful or fortuitous Negro can really feel this way. His journey will have cost him too much, and the price will be revealed in his estrangement unless he is very rare and lucky from other colored people, and in his continuing isolation from whites. Furthermore, for every Negro boy who achieves such a taxi ride, hundreds, at least, will have perished around him. And not because they lacked the boldness to dream, but because the Republic despises their dreams. Perhaps one must be in such a situation in order really to understand what it is. But if one is a Negro in Watts or Harlem, and knows why one is there, and knows that one has been sentenced to remain there for life, one can't but look on the American state and the American people as one's oppressors. For that, after all, is exactly what they are. They have corralled you where you are for their ease and their profit, and are doing all in their power to prevent you from finding out enough about yourself to be able to rejoice in the only life you have. One does not wish to believe that the American Negro can feel this way, but that is because the Christian world has been misled by its own rhetoric and narcoticized by its own power. For many generations, the natives of the Belgian Congo, for example, endured the most unspeakable atrocities at the hands of the Belgians, at the hands of Europe. Their suffering occurred in silence. This suffering was not indignantly reported in the Western press as the suffering of white men would have been. The suffering of this native was considered necessary, alas, for European Christian dominance. And since the world at large knew virtually nothing concerning the suffering of this native, when he rose, he was not hailed as a hero fighting for his land, but condemned as a savage, hungry for white flesh. The Christian world considered Belgium to be a civilized country, but there was not only no reason for the Congolese to feel that way about Belgium, there was no possibility that they could. What will the Christian world, which is so uneasily silent now, say on that day which is coming when the black native of South Africa begins to massacre the masters who have massacred him so long? It is true that two wrongs don't make a right, as we love to point out to the people we have wronged. But one wrong doesn't make a right either. People who have been wronged will attempt to right the wrong. They would not be people if they didn't. They can rarely afford to be scrupulous about the means they will use. They will use such means as come to hand. Neither in the main will they distinguish one oppressor from another, nor see through to the root principle of their oppression. In the American context, the most ironical thing about Negro anti-Semitism is that the Negro is really condemning the Jew for having become an American white man, for having become, in effect, a Christian. The Jew profits from his status in America, and he must expect Negroes to distrust him for it. The Jew does not realize that the credential he offers, the fact that he has been despised and slaughtered, does not increase the Negro's understanding. It increases the Negro's rage. For it is not here and not now that the Jew is being slaughtered, and he is never despised here as the Negro is, because he is an American. The Jewish travail occurred across the sea, and America rescued him from the house of bondage. But America is the house of bondage for the Negro, and no country can rescue him. What happens to the Negro here happens to him because he is an American. When an African is mistreated, for example, he has recourse to his embassy. The American Negro who is, let us say, falsely arrested will find it nearly impossible to bring his case to court. And this means that because he is a native of this country, quote, one of our niggers, end quote, he has effectively no recourse and no place to go. either within the country or without. He is a pariah in his own country and a stranger in the world. This is what it means to have one's history and one's ties to one's ancestral homeland totally destroyed. This is not what happened to the Jew, and therefore he has allies in the world. That is one of the reasons no one has ever seriously suggested that the Jew be nonviolent. There was no need for him to be nonviolent. On the contrary, the Jewish battle for Israel was saluted as the most tremendous heroism. How can the Negro fail to suspect that the Jew is really saying that the Negro deserves his situation because he has not been heroic enough? It is doubtful that the Jews could have won their battle had the Western powers been opposed to them. But such allies as the Negro may have are themselves struggling for their freedom against tenacious and tremendous Western opposition. This leaves the Negro, who technically represents the Western nations, in a cruelly ambiguous position. In this situation, it is not the American Jew who can either instruct him or console him. On the contrary, the American Jew knows just enough about this situation to be unwilling to imagine it again. Finally, what the American Negro interprets the Jew as saying is that one must take the historical, the impersonal point of view concerning one's life and concerning the lives of one's kinsmen and children. Quote, "We suffered too," end quote, one is told. Quote, "But we came through, and so will you, in time," end quote. In whose time? One has only one life. One may become reconciled to the ruin of one's own life, but to become reconciled to the ruin of one's children's lives is not reconciliation. It is the sickness unto death. And one knows that such counselors are not present on these shores by following this advice. They arrived here out of the same effort the American Negro is making. They wanted to live, and not tomorrow, but today, now. Since the Jew is living here, like all other white men living here, he wants the Negro to wait. And the Jew sometimes, often, does this in the name of his Jewishness, which is a terrible mistake. He has absolutely no relevance in this context as a Jew. His only relevance is that he is white and values his color and uses it. He is singled out by Negroes, not because he acts differently from other white men, but because he doesn't. His major distinction is given him by that history of Christendom, which has so successfully victimized both Negroes and Jews. And he is playing in Harlem the role assigned him by Christians long ago. He is doing their dirty work. No more than the good white people of the South, who are really responsible for the bombings and lynchings, are ever present at these events, do the people who really own Harlem ever appear at the door to collect the rent. One risks libel by trying to spell this out too precisely, but Harlem is really owned by a curious coalition, which includes some churches, some universities, some Christians, some Jews, and some Negroes. The capital of New York is Albany, which is not a Jewish state. And the Moses they sent us, whatever his ancestry, certainly failed to set the captive children free. A genuinely candid confrontation between American Negroes and American Jews would certainly prove of inestimable value. But the aspirations of the country are wretchedly middle class, and the middle class can never afford candor. What is really at question is the American way of life. What is really at question is whether Americans already have an identity or are still sufficiently flexible to achieve one. This is a painfully complicated question. For what now appears to be the American identity is really a bewildering and sometimes demoralizing blend of nostalgia and opportunism. For example, the Irish who march on St. Patrick's Day do not, after all, have any desire to go back to Ireland. They do not intend to go back to live there, though they may dream of going back there to die. Their lives, in the meanwhile, are here, but they cling at the same time to those credentials forged in the old world. Credentials which cannot be duplicated here. Credentials which the American Negro does not have. These credentials are the abandoned history of Europe, the abandoned and romanticized history of Europe. The Russian Jews here have no desire to return to Russia either, and they have not departed in great clouds for Israel, but they have the authority of knowing it is there. The Americans are no longer Europeans, but they are still living, at least as they imagine, on that capital. That capital also belongs, however, to the slaves who created it for Europe and who created it here. And in that sense, the Jew must see that he is part of the history of Europe and will always be so considered by the descendant of the slave. Always, that is, unless he himself is willing to prove that this judgment is inadequate and unjust. This is precisely what is demanded of all the other white men in this country, and the Jew will not find it easier than anybody else. The ultimate hope for a genuine black-white dialogue in this country lies in the recognition that the driven European serf merely created another serf here and created him on the basis of color. No one can deny that the Jew was a party to this, but it is senseless to assert that this was because of his Jewishness. One can be disappointed in the Jew if one is romantic enough for not having learned from his history. But if people did learn from history, history would be very different. All racist positions baffle and appall me. None of us are that different from one another, neither that much better nor that much worse. Furthermore, when one takes a position, one must attempt to see where that position inexorably leads. One must ask oneself, if one decides that black or white or Jewish people are, by definition, to be despised, is one willing to murder a black or white or Jewish baby? For that is where the position leads. And if one blames the Jew for having become a white American, one may perfectly well, if one is black, be speaking out of nothing more than envy. If one blames the Jew for not having been ennobled by oppression, one is not indicting the single figure of the Jew, but the entire human race. And one is also making a quite breathtaking claim for oneself. I know that my own oppression did not ennoble me, not even when I thought of myself as a practicing Christian. I also know that if today I refuse to hate Jews or anybody else, it is because I know how it feels to be hated. I learned this from Christians, and I ceased to practice what the Christians practiced. The crisis taking place in the world and in the minds and hearts of black men everywhere is not produced by the Star of David, but by the old, rugged Roman cross on which Christendom's most celebrated Jew was murdered, and not by Jews. James Baldwin, The New York Times Magazine, Sunday, April 9th, 1967. Please like, share, and subscribe for more history, mystery, and wisdom. Thank you for watching.